What is up, guys? Nick Skrip here live on the Fantrax YouTube, Twitter/X, and TikTok channels, talking Week 7 fantasy football, trying to highlight guys that I feel have a plus matchup. So stick with us as we get straight into it. Every week, I look at all of the matchups and I try to identify who has a plus matchup. And how do I do that? I look at past performances by the defenses. I look at what the defenses allow when it comes to yards per game through the air and on the ground, sometimes just scoring in general, too. And most importantly, fantasy points per game. What are teams allowing to different positions this season? I think that is key into identifying who has a plus fantasy football and could be a good DFS plug. So sometimes they're obvious, sometimes they're not. Let's kick things off here with Drake London. Drake London faces the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who allow the 8th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers and the 7th most passing yards per game this season. In Week 5, London finished the week with season highs in targets with 9 and receiving yards with 78, and he had 14.68 fantasy points. The very next week, Week 6, Drake London had season highs in targets with 12, receptions with 9, receiving yards with 125, and fantasy points with 21.5. Desmond Ritter's thrown the ball 37 and 47 times the last 2 games with over 300 passing yards in both games. So that presents some solid volume. So I know there was concerns with Drake London heading into, the opening parts of the season when it came to, the volume and what was going on there. But the last 2 weeks, we have good signs. And when you have good signs and a plus matchup, I like Drake London in this week's slot. Josh Jacobs, want to talk about him in that Bears matchup. So the Chicago Bears allow the 4th most fantasy points per game to running backs this season. Jimmy Garoppolo is not playing, backup quarterback. Justin Fields is not playing, backup quarterback. In a game of backup quarterbacks, who is going to be the feature for the Raiders? Number one, I do think that Davante Adams is going to see a ton of targets when you have a future Hall of Fame player in Davante Adams who is very mad about his role. He's been targeted very low the last 2 weeks. They're going to hyper-target him. But I want to talk about Josh Jacobs just because, again, 2 backup quarterbacks, it's not going to be a game through the air. It's going to be a game through the ground. And Josh Jacobs has finished back-to-back weeks with 25-plus touches, and he's played 81+% of the snaps. So Josh Jacobs has very good volume, and he's on the field pretty much the entire time. In weeks 4 and 5, he scored a touchdown in both of those games. He had a 19 fantasy point week. He had a season high of 77 rushing yards, which is not very good in comparison to what Jacobs had last season. He led the league in rushing. I'm going to say against Chicago this week, he is going to have a big fantasy week. He is going to have a season high in rushing yards. Next guy on the list here, Amari Cooper faces the Colts, who allow the 14th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers this season. We're not sure if Deshaun Watson is going to play. He's questionable right now. But in all honesty, Amari Cooper balled out just last week with P.J. Walker as the starting quarterback. 4 catches for 108 receiving yards on 8 targets, 14.8 fantasy points. Amari Cooper plus matchup here. He's had games of 16 and 24.6 fantasy points back in weeks 2 and 3. He's earned 8+ targets 3 times. He's finished with 90+ receiving yards 3 times. So I like him in this matchup, regardless if it's Deshaun Watson or P.J. Walker. Next on the list, Terry McLaurin. So Terry McLaurin plays the Giants, who allow the 12th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers this season. McLaurin has been heavily targeted in 2 of his last 3 games with Sam Howell, who has been truly stepping up as a quarterback. McLaurin earned 10 targets in week 4. He caught 8 of them for 86 yards and 22.6 fantasy points. Then in week 6, McLaurin caught 6 of his 11 targets for 81 yards and 14.1 fantasy points. So look for McLaurin in this matchup against the Giants to earn 10+ targets and continue to play well, especially with Sam Howell stepping up at the quarterback position. In this same game, I like Wan'Dale Robinson. Wan'Dale Robinson faces, again, the Commanders, who allow the third most fantasy points per game to wide receivers and the sixth most passing yards per game this season. Daniel Jones missed week 6, but he's been practicing. He's another guy that is questionable right now, but when we're looking at Wan'Dale Robinson, he didn't practice the entire week, but you have to remember that last year he tore that ACL. So I think when he's not practicing, sometimes it's more of a knee maintenance sort of thing. After missing the first 2 weeks of the season, Robinson has earned 5, 6, 6, and 8 targets. So that shows consistency in the targets that Wan'Dale Robinson has been earning. The volume is there for him consistently. And in week 6, he caught all 8 of his targets. So he's very efficient with what he's getting. For 62 yards, scored a season high 14.2 fantasy points. So looking at this matchup, great matchup on paper. Looking at week 6, he looked very good. I like Wan'Dale Robinson again this week to be a good flex option. So obviously you are going to play Stephon Diggs, right? You're going to play Stephon Diggs the entire season, week in and week out for fantasy football. But maybe this is more of a DFS play. The Patriots allow the 14th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers. Stephon Diggs has been one of the best wide receivers to roster for fantasy football. He was one of the best players you could have selected in the first round, and he was going at the end of the first round. He's currently the fantasy football wide receiver 2, averaging 23.2 fantasy points per game. For wide receivers, Diggs ranks number 3 in targets. He's tied for number 3 in receptions, number 3 in receiving yards. He's tied for number 2 in receiving touchdowns. 27 targets across the last 2 weeks, with all but one game over 100 receiving yards this season. It's been great for fantasy football. Very, very trustworthy play, especially for DFS against the Patriots. That same game, I want to talk about Ramondre Stevenson, who was questionable. Now he looks good to go. The Bills allow the 12th most fantasy points per game to running backs and the 8th most rushing yards per game this season. Ramondre Stevenson is coming off of his best fantasy week. He scored 18 points in week 6, where he ran the ball 10 times for 46 yards, scored a rushing touchdown, and important here, caught 5 passes. Ezekiel Elliott has created a committee to an extent when it comes to the Patriots, but Stevenson has played 64% plus of the snaps in all but one game this season. He had that ankle, issue going on, but he's good to go heading into this matchup. And running backs have been very, very efficient against the Bills this season. One of my favorite plays of the week is Marquise Hollywood Brown against the Seattle Seahawks, who allow the 2nd most fantasy points per game to wide receivers and the 5th most passing yards per game this season. Prior to week 6, Hollywood ranged somewhere between 16.1 and 17.4 fantasy points for 4 straight weeks. Very consistent fantasy production. The connection with the backup Joshua Dobbs has been very evident on a week-to-week basis. Hollywood has totaled 3 receiving touchdowns so far this season. There is a consistency in his volume. He's been targeted 10-plus times for 3 straight weeks and 4 times this season. So Hollywood Brown is getting a ton of targets on a consistent level, and Dobbs has been playing fairly well. We're going to get Kyler back within the next few weeks, it's looking like, who loves Hollywood Brown. But this specific week, I do like him a lot in this matchup, seeing that he has very consistent fantasy production outside of last week, seeing that the targets are there on a consistent level, and seeing that, again, the Seahawks are the 2nd best fantasy matchup for wide receivers. Let's talk some Kenneth Walker III. So the Cardinals allow the 3rd most fantasy points per game to running backs and the 9th most rushing yards per game. Kenneth Walker III cannot stop scoring touchdowns, as he scored in 4 straight games with 6 total touchdowns this season. He scored 17-plus fantasy points 3 times this year. He's ranged from 4.65 to 5.39 yards per carry in 3 games this season. He's had at least 17 touches in all of his last 4 games. He's played 71+% of the snaps in back-to-back games, so we don't fear Zach Charbonnet at all right now. The Cardinals are a great matchup. Kenneth Walker III cannot stop scoring. He's a great play this week. I do want to talk about Puka Nacua, because I think that there's hesitation because, one, Cooper Kupp's back and Puka just had a poor fantasy week. So the Steelers in this matchup allow the 4th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers and the 4th most passing yards per game. You think about Cooper Kupp instantly, but Puka has been a great play pretty much this entire season. I know it was a down week, but remember that Cooper Kupp, when he returned 2 weeks ago, both of those guys had over 10 targets. We're looking at a guy who scored 20-plus fantasy points in 4 games this season. Don't let one down week prevent you from playing Puka Nacua, at least in your flex. You likely picked him up off of waivers or drafted him super late. So he's not a guy like you drafted in the first round and now you're so concerned you want to trade him for anything. It's a great matchup. And, most importantly, I think we need to understand that the volume is there. Matthew Stafford has thrown the third most passing attempts so far this season. So can Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua operate and be very fantasy relevant? Absolutely. And I love this matchup for Puka this week. Another flex option just to talk about briefly is Joshua Palmer. It's not necessarily the most amazing matchup versus the Chiefs, but when you look at the game script of the Chargers versus the Chiefs, what are you going to say? You're going to say that this game is going to be played through the air, right? Keenan Allen's having an amazing season, so the attention is going to be on Keenan Allen when it comes to these two guys. Palmer has been operating as the team's wide receiver 2 since Mike Williams tore his ACL. Across the last 3 games played, Palmer has both earned 7 or 8 targets and finished with 60-plus receiving yards in those games. Across the last 2 games, Palmer has played 86% and 97% of the snaps, so he's on the field a ton, pretty much the entire game. He's consistently getting targets. He's having some decent receiving yard totals. And I think that in this specific game, if someone's a sneaky anytime touchdown scorer, it's Joshua Palmer with, the focus on Keenan Allen. Same matchup. Let's talk Rashee Rice, the second-round rookie for the Kansas City Chiefs. The Chargers allow the most fantasy points per game to wide receivers and the most passing yards per game. He's quietly the second most targeted player in the Chiefs, again, as a rookie. Rice is coming off of a season-high 78 receiving yards in Week 6. He scored double-digit fantasy points for the 4th time this season last week. Rice has earned 5 or more Patrick Mahomes targets 4 times this season and scored 2 touchdowns. When you are getting Patrick Mahomes targets, it's a bit different than most quarterbacks in the league. So he's been a very impactful wide receiver. We just need him to start playing above 50% of the snaps. That's the one asterisk for Rashee Rice. But all signs are pointing in the direction that this could be the breakout week for the rookie. Another guy to mention, rookie here that could have a breakout week, Luke Musgrave. The Broncos allow the most fantasy points per game to tight ends this season. Prior to Week 6, which was the bye for the Packers, Luke Musgrave led the Packers in receptions with 6 on his 7 targets in Week 5. Musgrave exited the Week 4 matchup with a concussion, but he earned 8 targets in the game prior. So when we're looking at Luke Musgrave, we've seen 2 games where he's getting a lot of looks, and he's shown us some receiving yard upside this season. He's had games of 49 and 50 yards. So maybe not the receiving yard upside like a Kelsey has, but for a rookie to be coming in and being a consistent target for Jordan Love, I think that says a lot. I think those two have a very good connection. And looking at this matchup, it's a great matchup for both him and Jordan Love. I love them both. They're both 2 of my starts of the week for Week 7 fantasy football. Going to talk about 2 guys for the Sunday night game, which should be a really fun one. I barely ever make it to the Sunday night game, but it's going to be the Dolphins versus the Eagles. Jalen Waddle. The Eagles allow the 6th most fantasy points per game to wide receivers this season. The first thing you think about when you hear that is Tyreek Hill, who has been on absolute fire all season. He's had 142 more receiving yards than any other receiver in the league so far, if we don't count Thursday Night Football. But I don't think that was an impact, to be honest. I do want to highlight Jalen Waddle, though. He's been trending upwards. He's been targeted 19 times across the last 2 games. He caught a touchdown in each of those games, 14.5 and 18.1 fantasy points. It's been looking good for Jalen Waddle when things have been concerning. Early on in the season, he opened up weeks 1 and 2 with 19.5 and 21.5 yards per catch, which is very Jalen Waddle. But now he's getting more targets and he's scoring. So in a huge matchup, both teams are 5-1. I think Jalen Waddle steps up, especially with Tyreek Hill again getting the focus. Last guy I'll mention here, A.J. Brown. So A.J. Brown faces, again, same matchup. The Dolphins allow the 10th most fantasy points per game. 2 wide receivers this season. A.J. Brown has been on absolute fire the last 4 games in a row, especially in the receiving yard department. 131, 175, 127, and 131 receiving yards in the last 4 games. That's resulted in 22.1, 38.5, 18.7, and 20.1 fantasy points during that stretch. Jalen Hurts and Brown have a great connection, and that specific connection is going to be very, very key to get a win. Again, both of these teams, the Dolphins and Eagles, are 5-1. So it's going to be a matchup that The studs are going to have to come out. That'll do it for the YouTube and the Twitter or X live streams. I'll stay live here on TikTok to answer some questions, but good luck this week, guys, in your Week 7 matchups, and be sure you are following the Fantrax socials on wherever you consume your fantasy football content.